Welcome to Nightshift Horror. Before we check in tonight, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now get comfortable. The night shift is about to begin.
Story 1. The intake note dated December 32nd. I watched the cursor blink in the date field for 3 full seconds before I noticed the year-end system glitch. December 32nd, 2024. The electronic medical record had accepted it without error, populated the timestamp, and generated a provisional patient ID. I should have rejected the entry immediately. Instead, I clicked through to the demographic screen, telling myself I'd correct it after completing the basic information. That's how these things begin, with small procedural compromises made in the name of efficiency. My name is Claire Howell, and I worked as a psychiatric intake clinician at Riverside Behavioral Health Center for 7 years before the incident I'm about to describe. My role was straightforward: conduct initial assessments, determine acuity levels, and facilitate appropriate placement for individuals experiencing psychiatric crises. The work required attention to detail, clinical judgment, and the ability to document efficiently under pressure. I prided myself on maintaining accurate records. My supervisor had commended me twice for my thoroughness during joint commission reviews. The final week of December was always peculiar in psychiatric settings. Staff rotations shifted to accommodate holiday schedules. Non-emergency admissions slowed considerably. Patients stable enough for discharge were transitioned to outpatient care or transferred to step-down facilities, reducing our census to those deemed too acute or too complex to move. The rhythm of the ward changed during this period, quieter, somehow more isolated, and as though the building itself were holding its breath until the new year. I arrived for my shift on December 28th at 11 p.m., the start of what we called the graveyard intake rotation. The emergency department typically sent psychiatric consults throughout the night, but holiday weeks were unpredictable. Sometimes we'd see no one. Other times, the loneliness and stress of the season would drive people to crisis points, and we'd be overwhelmed. I preferred the busy nights. They passed faster. The intake office was located on the ground floor adjacent to the secure entry vestibule. It was a small room with institutional furniture. A desk, 2 chairs, a computer terminal, and a filing cabinet that hadn't been opened in years since we'd gone fully digital. A narrow window overlooked the parking lot, though at night it mostly reflected the fluorescent lights back at me. I made coffee, logged into the system, and reviewed the current census. 41 patients across 3 units. 12 flagged for potential discharge pending morning rounds, standard for the season. At 1:14 a.m., the desk phone rang. ED registration notified me of an incoming psychiatric evaluation. Male, mid-40s, brought in by police after a welfare check. No acute medical concerns. Cooperative but disorganized in thought. I printed the initial screening form and walked to the vestibule to meet the patient. He was sitting in the holding area with remarkable stillness, hands folded in his lap, staring at the floor. His clothes were clean but mismatched. A summer shirt under a heavy winter coat. Canvas shoes without socks despite the temperature outside being in the 20s. The police officer who'd transported him was completing paperwork at the desk. I introduced myself and asked the patient if he was willing to speak with me. He looked up slowly, made brief eye contact, and nodded once. We walked to the intake office together. He moved with careful precision, as though each step required conscious thought. I offered him the chair across from my desk and sat down, opening a new assessment in the electronic system. The timestamp populated automatically. December 29th, 2024, 01:23 a.m. I began with standard demographic questions. His name was Leon Voss. Date of birth, March 11th, 1979. No permanent address, currently staying at a men's shelter on Meridian Street. He answered clearly but with odd pauses. as though translating his thoughts from another language before speaking. When I asked about his reason for coming to the hospital, he said he'd been having difficulty distinguishing between days, that they'd started to overlap in his mind, that he'd lost track of which conversations had already happened and which were yet to occur. I documented his responses verbatim. Disorganized thought processes were common in acute psychiatric presentations, particularly in individuals experiencing psychotic symptoms or severe anxiety. I asked about hallucinations. He said no, he didn't hear voices or see things that weren't there. He described it differently. He said time felt less linear than it should, that he'd been experiencing the same day from multiple angles. I noted this as circumstantial speech with possible loose associations. We continued through the assessment. No suicidal ideation, no homicidal ideation, no recent substance use. He'd been admitted to psychiatric facilities 3 times previously, most recently 2 years ago for what he described as a similar episode. He'd been prescribed antipsychotic medication then, but had stopped taking it after discharge due to side effects. He couldn't remember the name of the medication. By 0200 hours, I'd completed the clinical interview and determined that voluntary admission was appropriate. Leon met criteria for acute psychiatric stabilization. He was experiencing clear thought disturbances, he lacked stable housing, and he expressed willingness to accept help. I began entering the admission orders into the system. That's when I first saw the date field error. December 32nd, 2024. I stared at it, confused, then checked the computer's system clock in the bottom right corner of the screen. It displayed the correct date, December 29th, but the medical record timestamp insisted it was 3 days later, a date that didn't exist. I clicked into the field to manually correct it, but the drop-down calendar wouldn't open. The date was locked. I tried logging out and back in. The error persisted. I called the IT helpline, which during night shifts forwarded to a contracted service. The technician I spoke with asked me to describe the problem. I explained. There was a long pause. He asked me to read the exact text in the field. I did. Another pause. He told me that the system sometimes generated placeholder dates during year-end processing, and that if it had accepted the entry without an error message, I should proceed with the admission. He assured me the date would auto-correct during the nightly audit process. This explanation made no sense. Medical record timestamps weren't placeholders. They were legal documentation. But it was past 2 a.m. I had a patient waiting for bed assignment, and arguing with contracted IT support was pointless. I completed the admission orders, noting in the clinical narrative that there was a system timestamp error to be corrected by morning administrative staff. I printed Leon's wristband, which displayed the impossible date, and walked him to the acute unit. The night nurse, a woman named Bryn, accepted the admission without comment. She was finishing another patient's medication pass and seemed grateful that Leon was cooperative and stable. I provided a brief verbal handoff, returned to my office, and documented the encounter in my shift log, including the date discrepancy. Then I sat back and drank cold coffee, trying to dismiss the small wrongness I felt. The rest of the night was quiet. No further admissions. I used the time to complete overdue training modules and review updated protocols for the new year. At 6:45 a.m., as my shift ended, I sent an email to the informatics department detailing the date error and requesting follow-up. Then I drove home, slept poorly, and returned the next evening at 11 p.m. My supervisor stopped me before I could reach the intake office. She asked if I'd admitted a patient named Leon Voss the previous night. I confirmed. She looked uncomfortable. She said there was no record of the admission in the system, no chart, no bed assignment, no census entry. I told her that was impossible. I'd completed the entire intake process and escorted him to the acute unit myself. She asked if I had any printed documentation. I did. I kept a paper log as a personal backup, a habit from my early training. We went to my office together. I showed her my handwritten notes. Leon Voss, date of birth. March 11th, 1979, admitted 0200 hours. She looked at the notes for a long moment, then asked me to log into the system and search for his name. I did. No results. I searched by date of birth. Nothing. I checked the unit census. His bed was listed as vacant, last occupied on December 27th by a different patient who'd since been discharged. My supervisor suggested I speak with Bryn directly. We walked to the acute unit. Bryn was at the nursing station completing her morning charting. I asked her about Leon Voss. She looked at me blankly. She said she didn't remember admitting anyone that night. I reminded her of the details, the mismatched clothing, the quiet demeanor. She shook her head slowly. She said the unit had been quiet, no admissions during her shift. I felt a specific kind of coldness then, a sensation that started in my chest and spread outward. I asked to see the unit logbook, the physical binder where nurses documented every entry and exit. Bryn retrieved it. I scanned the pages. December 29th, 0100 hours to 0700 hours, no admissions recorded. But my handwriting was clear in my personal notes. I had the printed wristband from the admission in my bag at home. I'd forgotten to dispose of it properly. My supervisor suggested I take the rest of the week off. She framed it as a concern for my well-being, noting that year-end rotations were exhausting and that perhaps I'd been more fatigued than I realized. I didn't argue. I left the building, sat in my car in the parking lot, and called the contracted IT helpline again. I explained the situation. The same technician answered. I recognized his voice. He checked the server logs. He said there was no record of my session creating an admission on December 29th. He paused, then added something strange. He said the system showed a completed intake assessment timestamped December 32nd, 2024 at 01:23 a.m., but that the entry was locked in a pending verification status. He couldn't access the details. I asked what pending verification meant. He said he didn't know. That status designation didn't exist in the current system architecture. He suggested I contact the informatics department directly during business hours. I didn't take time off. I came back for my shift that night, December 30th. I needed to understand what had happened. I logged in and manually searched for any intake entries with unusual timestamps. The system let me filter by date. I entered December 32nd, 2024. One result appeared: Leon Voss, date of birth March 11th, 1979, assessment completed by C. Howell. Status: pending verification. I clicked the entry. The full assessment loaded. Every question I'd asked, every answer he'd given documented exactly as I remembered. But at the bottom of the chart was a field I hadn't seen during the original entry. Expected completion date. It was populated with a date, January 4th, 2025. I stared at that field for a long time. Expected completion of what? Admissions didn't have completion dates. They had discharge dates, and those were determined clinically, not predicted during intake. I scrolled through the rest of the chart. Everything was locked. I couldn't edit, couldn't add notes, couldn't change the status. The system treated the entry as simultaneously complete and unfinished. I called the acute unit. A different nurse answered. I asked if there was a patient named Leon Voss currently on the unit. She checked. She said no. I asked if there had been anyone by that name admitted within the past week. She checked the paper logbook again. She said no. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I did something I'd never done before. I left my office during shift and walked through the hospital, checking every psychiatric unit. I used my badge to access the acute unit, the subacute unit, and the geriatric psychiatry wing. I looked at every patient board, every name on every door. Leon Voss wasn't there, but as I walked back through the acute unit, I passed a room near the end of the hall. The door was partially open. Inside, a man sat on the edge of the bed with remarkable stillness, hands folded in his lap, staring at the floor. He wore a hospital gown and a wristband I couldn't read from the doorway. I stopped walking. I stood outside the room for several seconds, then knocked softly. The man looked up. It was him, Leon Voss. Same face, same careful movements. I said his name. He nodded slowly as though he'd been expecting me. I asked what he was doing here. He said I'd admitted him. I asked when. He paused, thinking. He said he wasn't sure, that it felt both recent and distant, that he'd been here before I arrived, and that he'd still be here after I left. I checked his wristband. It was blank. No name, no date of birth, no medical record number. Just a strip of white plastic around his wrist. I asked how long he'd been in this room. He said time felt less linear than it should, that he'd been experiencing the same admission from multiple angles. I left the room without another word and returned to my office. I documented nothing. I sat at my desk until my shift ended at 7 a.m. Then I went home and didn't sleep. I called the informatics department at 9 a.m. when they opened. I explained everything. The impossible date, the pending verification status, the expected completion date field, the patient I'd seen but who had no official record. The analyst I spoke with said she'd investigate and call me back. She called 3 hours later. She said the system had flagged the entry as a data integrity error during the year-end audit, that the timestamp was beyond the valid range for the current calendar year, that the entry had been quarantined pending manual review. She said this sometimes happened when clinicians worked across the midnight boundary during year-end processing. She said the system would hold the entry in a suspended state until the expected completion date, at which point it would either be validated or purged depending on administrative review. I asked what that meant in practical terms. She said the admission existed in the system but not in operational reality, that it was waiting to be confirmed. I asked if she could see the patient's current location. She said the location field was blank. I asked if she could delete the entry. She said only the original creator could do that, and only after the expected completion date had passed. I asked why the expected completion date was January 4th. She said she didn't know, that the field was auto-populated based on system logic she couldn't access. Then she said something that made my hands go cold. She said the system showed I'd logged into the intake terminal on December 32nd, 2024 at 01:23 a.m. Not December 29th, December 32nd. She said my session duration was logged as -4 days. I hung up. I sat in my apartment looking at my personal notes, at the printed wristband with the impossible date. I thought about Leon Voss sitting in that room with his blank wristband, experiencing the same admission from multiple angles. I thought about the expected completion date, January 4th. I thought about what completion might mean. I haven't returned to work since that conversation. I submitted my resignation via email on December 31st. My supervisor called me twice. I didn't answer. She left voicemails expressing concern, asking me to come in to discuss what had happened, assuring me that fatigue-related documentation errors were understandable and not punitive. I didn't respond. It's January 3rd now. Tomorrow is January 4th. I've been checking the electronic medical record system remotely using my still active login credentials. Leon Voss's chart remains in pending verification status. The expected completion date hasn't changed. I don't know what will happen tomorrow. I don't know if the system will validate the admission or purge it. I don't know if completion means discharge or something else entirely. What I know is this. I created an entry that exists outside the calendar. I documented an interaction that the hospital insists never happened. I admitted a patient who occupies a bed that's officially vacant. And the system expects something to be completed tomorrow. Something I initiated when I accepted that impossible date and proceeded with the admission. I keep thinking about what Leon said, that he'd been here before I arrived and that he'd still be here after I left. That time felt less linear than it should. I think about the intake process, how we create official existence through documentation, how patients enter the system and are supposed to leave it, how the records are meant to close. Some records don't close. They remain in pending verification, waiting for an expected completion that has nothing to do with discharge. And some patients exist in the space between documented and real, admitted on dates that don't exist, waiting in rooms that aren't officially occupied. I'll be checking the system tomorrow at midnight. I need to see what completion looks like. I need to know if the admission will be validated or if it will disappear entirely, taking Leon Voss with it. Or if something else will happen. Something the system has been waiting for since I accepted that impossible date and clicked through to the next screen. Because I think now that the date wasn't a glitch. I think it was accurate. I think I completed an intake on December 32nd, 2024, exactly as documented. And tomorrow, when the expected completion date arrives, the system will reconcile that impossibility. I used to believe that medical records were just documentation, neutral accounts of events that had already occurred. Now I understand there's something else. They're predictions waiting to be fulfilled, entries waiting to be verified, admissions that create the very events they're meant to describe. And I wonder if other clinicians have made the same error I did. If there are other pending verifications scattered through the system, other patients waiting in rooms that don't officially exist, other expected completion dates approaching with quiet inevitability. Some documentation doesn't describe reality. It prescribes it. And once you've created the record, all that's left is to wait for the world to conform to what you've written. Story 2. The observation room that never emptied. I found the discrepancy during routine morning rounds when I was cross-referencing the unit census with the observation log. Observation room C showed continuous occupancy for 73 hours without a documented discharge. Every other detail was correct. Vital signs recorded every 15 minutes, behavioral observations noted hourly, meal consumption tracked, medication administration logged. But there was no patient name attached to the monitoring, just a room number and an unbroken chain of documentation suggesting someone had been under observation since December 28th. I stood at the nursing station, scrolling back through the digital logs, searching for the initial placement entry that should have started the observation period. It wasn't there. My name is Rebecca Tate, and I worked as a registered nurse on the acute psychiatric unit at Riverside Behavioral Health Center for 9 years before the events I'm documenting here occurred. The unit housed 32 beds arranged in 3 wings, with 4 observation rooms positioned near the central nursing station for patients requiring enhanced monitoring. Observation protocols were straightforward. Patients placed on continuous observation were assigned to dedicated rooms equipped with reinforced furniture, ligature-resistant fixtures, and direct visual monitoring capabilities. Staff documented every 15 minutes. A patient could only be removed from observation status after a physician's order, and a documented improvement in acuity. Room C was the 3rd observation room down the east corridor, positioned between rooms B and D. It was identical to the others in design, approximately 120 square feet, a single bed bolted to the floor, a small attached bathroom with a privacy door that couldn't lock, one window reinforced with laminated safety glass overlooking the interior courtyard. The room was meant to be functional and safe, nothing more. I'd placed dozens of patients there over the years without incident. The final week of December was always understaffed. Holiday schedules meant operating with minimum coverage, often pulling nurses from other units to maintain safe ratios. The patient census had been decreasing steadily since Christmas. As anticipated, discharges processed, transfers completed, elective admissions postponed until after the new year. By December 28th, we had 18 patients on the unit, with only one in observation status, a young woman in Room A being monitored for suicidal ideation following an overdose. Rooms B, C, and D were empty, or they were supposed to be empty. I arrived for my shift on December 31st at 6:45 a.m., relieving the night nurse, a man named Marcus who looked exhausted. We completed bedside handoff for each patient, walking room to room, reviewing overnight events and treatment plans. When we finished, Marcus mentioned something odd. He said Room C's observation log had been running all night, generating automatic timestamps even though the room was unoccupied. He'd assumed it was a system error. Sometimes the monitoring software failed to properly terminate when a patient was discharged. He said he'd meant to call IT but had gotten busy with medication passes and forgotten. He apologized and said I should probably put in a ticket to get it reset. I told him not to worry about it, that I'd handle it. He left. I returned to the nursing station and pulled up the observation monitoring dashboard. All 4 observation rooms were displayed on a grid. Room A showed active monitoring with the patient's name and current status. Rooms B and D showed inactive, awaiting assignment. Room C showed active monitoring, but the patient name field was blank. I clicked into the detailed log. Observation started December 28th, 0600 hours. No initiating provider listed, no patient demographic information. But 3 days of detailed monitoring entries. Vital signs within normal limits, patient resting quietly, no acute distress observed, meals delivered and partially consumed. Bathroom visits supervised at appropriate intervals. Every entry was time-stamped and bore staff initials. Different nurses across multiple shifts, all people I knew, all documenting observations of a patient who apparently didn't exist. I checked the unit census again. Room C was listed as vacant. I called over to Jen, another nurse working the morning shift, and asked her to look at something. She came over, read the log entries, frowned. She said it was definitely a software glitch, that the system must have carried over data from a previous patient and was auto-populating fields. I asked her if she remembered observing anyone in Room C recently. She said no. The last patient in that room had been discharged on December 27th, a middle-aged man with bipolar disorder who'd stabilized quickly. She'd done his discharge paperwork herself. I scrolled through the entries again, focusing on the staff initials. JK, that was Jen. MR, Marcus, BL, Bryn, the night nurse who'd worked the previous 2 nights. I called Bryn's cell. She answered after 4 rings, her voice thick with sleep. I apologized for waking her and asked if she remembered documenting observations in Room C over the past few nights. There was a long silence. She said she didn't remember specifically, but that she might have, if the system had prompted her. She did a lot of documentation on autopilot during night shifts, especially during holiday weeks when things were slow. I thanked her and let her go back to sleep. I walked down the east corridor to Room C. The door was closed, which was standard for vacant rooms. I knocked out of habit, waited 2 seconds, then opened it. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made with standard-issue linens. The bathroom was clean. The small built-in closet was empty. No personal belongings, no patient items, no evidence that anyone had occupied the space recently. But on the bedside table there was a meal tray from breakfast service. Scrambled eggs, toast, a container of orange juice. The eggs had been partially eaten. I stood very still, looking at that tray. Dietary services didn't deliver meals to vacant rooms. The system automatically generated meal tickets based on the active census. If room C was officially vacant, there should be no meal tray. But there it was, with food that had been consumed. I returned to the nursing station and called dietary. I asked if they'd delivered a breakfast tray to room C that morning. The staff member I spoke with checked the delivery log. She confirmed. One standard tray delivered to room C at 07:30 as scheduled. I asked why a tray would be delivered to a vacant room. She said the system had flagged room C as occupied, so they'd sent a tray. She asked if there was a problem. I said no, that I'd look into it, and thanked her. I sat down and tried to think clearly. The observation log showed continuous monitoring for 3 days. Dietary had been delivering meals. Multiple nurses had been documenting routine observations. But no one could specifically remember doing so, and there was no patient officially assigned to the room. The most rational explanation was a cascading system error, a failed discharge process that had left residual data active in multiple connected systems. These things happened occasionally during software updates or year-end processing. The solution was to manually terminate the observation, clear the room status, and submit a detailed ticket to IT for review. I clicked into the observation log interface looking for the Terminate Observation button. It was grayed out. The system wouldn't let me end the observation period. A tooltip appeared when I hovered over the button. Observation termination requires physician order. I checked the patient chart interface. There was no chart associated with room C because there was no patient. I called the attending psychiatrist, Dr. Mehta, and explained the situation. He listened patiently, then said he'd come by to review it in person after morning rounds on the geriatric unit. He arrived 40 minutes later. I walked him through everything: the observation log, the meal deliveries, the blank patient field, the inability to terminate the monitoring. He looked thoughtful. He asked to see the room. We walked down the corridor together. He opened the door, surveyed the empty space. He noticed the meal tray immediately. He asked how long it had been there. I said since breakfast. He picked up the container of orange juice, still sealed. He set it back down and stood quietly for a moment, then asked me to show him the monitoring entries again. Back at the nursing station, he scrolled through the log slowly. He paused on one entry from December 29th, 0200 hours. The note read, "Patient resting quietly in bed, eyes closed, no acute distress. Vitals stable, no response to verbal check-in. Continued observation maintained." He asked who had written that entry. I checked the initials. MR, Marcus. Dr. Mehta asked if Marcus was reliable. I said yes, absolutely, one of the most conscientious nurses on the unit. Dr. Mehta nodded slowly. He said the entry suggested Marcus had visually observed someone in the room, that he'd attempted verbal interaction. That wasn't something auto-populated by software. I suggested we call Marcus and ask him directly. Dr. Mehta agreed. I called Marcus's cell. He answered after 2 rings. I put the phone on speaker. I asked Marcus to think back to the night of December 29th, specifically around 0200 hours, and tell me if he remembered checking on room C. Marcus was quiet for several seconds. Then he said he did remember, that he'd done his routine 15-minute observation rounds, and when he'd looked into room C through the door window, he'd seen a patient in bed. He'd opened the door quietly, not wanting to disturb them, and done his visual check. The patient had appeared to be sleeping. He'd documented it and moved on. I asked him if he remembered the patient's face or any identifying features. He said no. Just a figure under the blankets turned away from the door. He said he'd assumed it was someone who'd been admitted earlier in his shift, that maybe he'd missed the handoff details because of how busy things had been. Dr. Mehta thanked him and I ended the call. We looked at each other. Dr. Mehta said we should review the security footage. The observation rooms had continuous video recording as a safety protocol. If Marcus had seen someone in the room, the video would show it. We contacted security and requested footage review for room C, December 29th, 0200 hours. The security supervisor, a man named Dale, met us in the small monitoring office adjacent to the main entrance. He pulled up the archived footage. The timestamp showed December 29th, 0155. The camera angle covered most of the room from an elevated corner position. The bed was clearly visible. It was empty. Dale fast-forwarded slowly. At 0200 hours exactly, the door opened. Marcus entered exactly as he'd described, moving quietly, approaching the bed, pausing for several seconds, then leaving and closing the door. He'd moved as though observing someone sleeping, but the bed was empty the entire time. Dale replayed it. Same thing. Marcus performing a check on an unoccupied bed. Dr. Mehta asked Dale to pull footage from earlier that day. Dale complied. We watched hours of footage. The room remained empty. But at meal delivery times, dietary staff entered, placed trays on the bedside table and left. During each subsequent check, the food appeared partially consumed. Staff entered throughout the day, performing routine observations, documenting on their tablets, behaving exactly as they would with an occupied room. But the bed was always empty. Dr. Mehta requested footage from December 28th, the documented start of the observation period. Dale pulled it up. At 0558, the room was empty. At 0600 hours, the exact start time in the log, nothing changed. No one entered, no patient was placed in the room. But immediately after that timestamp, the first observation entry appeared in the log. Observation initiated per clinical protocol. Patient-oriented and cooperative, no acute distress, vitals stable. We watched in silence for several minutes. Dr. Mehta finally said we needed to physically verify the room's status and manually override the system. That whatever was happening, software error, data corruption, mass documentation mistake, needed to be stopped. He said he'd write an order terminating observation and we'd manually reset the room. Dale said he'd flag the footage for IT review. We returned to the unit. Dr. Mehta wrote the termination order in the system. I attempted to execute it. The system rejected it. Cannot terminate observation for patient with active safety protocol. Physician authorization required. Dr. Mehta was standing right there. He'd written the authorization. The system wouldn't accept it. He tried logging in with his credentials and entering the order directly. Same error. He called the informatics department. He explained the situation with forced patience. The analyst he spoke with said she'd escalate it to the system administrator. That it would likely require a manual database correction. That someone would address it after the new year when full staffing returned. Dr. Mehta said this couldn't wait until after the new year. The analyst said there was nothing she could do about staffing. That non-critical system issues were being deferred. Dr. Mehta asked how she defined critical. She didn't answer directly. She said she'd note it as high priority and someone would reach out within 48 hours. Dr. Mehta ended the call. He looked at me and said something I didn't expect. He said we should leave the room as is, that we should continue documenting observations as the system required until IT resolved the error. That fighting the software was pointless and would only create more documentation problems. I asked if he was serious. He said yes. that there was no patient at risk, so there was no clinical harm in maintaining observation logs on an empty room, that it was absurd but ultimately harmless. He told me to have staff continue their routine checks and document accordingly, and that he'd follow up with informatics in the new year. I wanted to argue, but he was the attending physician, and his logic, while disturbing, was technically sound. If the room was empty, continuing observation was indeed harmless. So I agreed. That evening during my shift, I did my 15-minute rounds. When I reached room C, I paused outside the door. I looked through the narrow window. The bed appeared empty. I opened the door. The bed was empty. But the meal tray from lunch had been placed on the bedside table, and the food had been partially eaten. I documented: patient resting in room, meal partially consumed, no acute distress observed, continued monitoring maintained. I felt absurd writing it, but the system required it. The next nurse during the night shift did the same, and the next, and the next. We all documented observations on an empty room because the system insisted someone was there and wouldn't allow us to stop. It became routine, disturbing but routine. We joked about it darkly at the nursing station, calling it the ghost patient, the invisible admission. But underneath the jokes there was discomfort, because we were all documenting care for someone who didn't exist, and the system accepted every entry without question. On January 2nd, I was working another morning shift. I did my rounds as usual. When I opened the door to room C, I stopped. The bed wasn't empty. Someone was lying there, turned toward the wall, blankets pulled up. I stood frozen in the doorway. I said hello, my voice uncertain. No response. I stepped closer. I reached out to touch the shoulder. My hand passed through the blankets and touched the mattress. There was no one there, but I'd seen someone. I was certain. I stepped back, my heart pounding. I looked again. The bed was empty. I left the room and returned to the nursing station. I didn't document what I'd seen. I couldn't. How do you document a visual hallucination in a professional log? I finished my shift in silence and went home. The next day, Jen mentioned something during handoff. She said she'd gone into room C the previous evening and sworn she'd seen a patient in bed. But when she'd approached to do vitals, there was no one there. She laughed nervously, saying she must be more tired than she thought. Another nurse, overhearing, said she'd experienced the same thing 2 days earlier. We stood there, 3 nurses, admitting we'd all seen something that wasn't there. That's when I understood. The observation wasn't documenting a patient, it was creating one. The continuous monitoring, the meal deliveries, the routine documentation, all of it was building the presence of someone who had never been admitted. The system had started the observation and now it was sustaining it, and we were helping by continuing to document. Every entry, every check, every note was reinforcing the existence of a patient who occupied room C not through admission, but through accumulated observation. I haven't worked a shift since January 3rd. I submitted notice yesterday. My supervisor tried to talk me out of it, saying I was one of their best nurses, that year-end stress was affecting everyone, that things would improve. I didn't tell her the real reason. I didn't tell her that room C is still showing active observation, that the monitoring log is still running, that dietary is still delivering meals that are partially consumed by no one, that nurses are still documenting routine checks on an empty bed that sometimes isn't empty when you look at it from the doorway. I checked the observation dashboard remotely last night using my still active login. Room C has now been in continuous observation for 10 days. The documentation is flawless. Every 15-minute check completed, every meal tracked, every behavioral note recorded. The system is satisfied. The protocols are being followed. And somewhere in the space between the documentation and the reality, Something is occupying that room built entirely from our observations, existing only because we keep confirming that it's there. They'll figure it out eventually, or they won't. Either way, I won't be there to document it. Because I've learned something fundamental about observation. It's not passive. The act of watching, of checking, of documenting, it doesn't just record what's there. Sometimes it creates it. And once you've created something through continuous observation, I'm not sure you can ever make it stop existing. You can only keep watching, keep documenting, keep feeding it with your attention until it becomes more real than the empty room it occupies. Story 3. Annual Risk Assessment. The year-end risk assessment was a procedural formality I had completed without incident for 13 consecutive years at Riverside Behavioral Health Center. Each December, attending psychiatrists reviewed their active caseloads and generated standardized risk projections for patients likely to remain in treatment through the new year. The assessments addressed suicide risk, violence risk, elopement risk, and anticipated treatment trajectory. They were meant to ensure continuity of care and flag potential safety concerns during the reduced staffing of the holiday period. The process was tedious but straightforward. Review each patient's recent course, apply clinical judgment, document projected risk levels, and submit the completed forms to the Medical Records Department by December 31st. I had always completed mine by December 29th, giving myself cushion before the deadline. My name is Dr. Jonathan Reeves, and I have practiced as an attending psychiatrist in acute inpatient settings for 18 years. My approach to patient care is methodical and evidence-based. I document thoroughly. I consider multiple perspectives before forming clinical opinions. I do not make impulsive decisions. These qualities have served me well throughout my career, and I have maintained an exemplary record with no significant adverse events under my care. What I am about to describe contradicts every rational principle I have relied upon in my professional life, but I am documenting it precisely because of that contradiction. On December 27th, I began the annual risk assessment process. I had 14 patients currently assigned to my service, a manageable number for the holiday week. I started with the most acute cases, working my way toward those with more stable presentations. The assessment form was standardized across the hospital system. Patient demographics, current diagnoses, recent behavioral observations, risk rating scales, and a narrative section for clinical impressions and projections. I completed the first 3 assessments without difficulty. The 4th patient was a man named Alan Cutler, age 38, admitted December 18th following a suicide attempt via overdose. He had borderline personality disorder with recurrent major depressive episodes. His hospital course had been turbulent, periods of engagement alternating with hostility towards staff, self-injurious gestures, threats to leave against medical advice. By December 27th, he had stabilized somewhat. He was participating in groups, sleeping through the night, tolerating medication adjustments. I projected moderate ongoing suicide risk with improvement trajectory, recommended continued acute hospitalization through January 7th, and noted that outpatient transition would require intensive follow-up coordination. I completed the assessment, saved it, and moved to the next file. But as I closed Alan Cutler's chart, I noticed something odd. There was a second document in his file with the same title, Annual Risk Assessment. The date stamp showed December 27th, completed at 14:23, which was the current time, the exact moment I had just saved my assessment. I clicked on the duplicate entry, assuming it was a system error that had created 2 versions. It wasn't a duplicate, it was a different assessment. The demographic section was identical. The diagnosis section was identical. But the narrative section contained observations I had not written. The language was mine, I recognized my own syntax, my characteristic phrasing, the way I structured clinical impressions. But the content described events that had not yet occurred. The entry read, "Patient continues pattern of splitting behaviors with staff, idealizing primary nurse while devaluing treatment team during morning rounds on December 29th. Demonstrated escalating agitation afternoon of December 30th following family phone contact, requiring PRN medication and room restriction. Made overt suicidal statements to peer on evening of December 31st, necessitating transfer to observation status. Risk level elevated from moderate to high. Anticipate continued acute hospitalization, minimum 14 additional days." I read it 3 times. The assessment described specific incidents: rounds on the 29th, agitation on the 30th, suicidal statements on the 31st, that had not happened yet. It was dated December 27th, the current day, but projected forward through events spanning the next 4 days. And it was written in my voice with my clinical style, as though I had observed and documented things that existed only as possibilities. I checked the document metadata, created by J. Reeves. Creation timestamp, December 27th, 1423. The exact time I had completed my actual assessment. I looked at the author field of my real assessment. Same information. Both documents claimed to be written by me at the same moment. Both were now part of Alan Cutler's permanent medical record. I called the informatics department. I explained that there appeared to be a duplicate assessment document in a patient file, but with different content. The analyst asked me to forward her the file link. I did. She reviewed it remotely while I waited on the line. After a long pause, she said she only saw one risk assessment document in Alan Cutler's file. I told her there were 2. She said her system showed one. I asked her to read me the narrative section. She did. It was the assessment I hadn't written, the one describing events that hadn't happened yet. I asked where my original assessment was. She said she was looking at the only assessment in the file. I insisted I had written a different version. She suggested I check my local drafts folder. I did. My original assessment was there unsaved, flagged as a version conflict. The system had replaced it with the other version, the one describing the future. I asked how that was possible. She said it wasn't. That version conflicts only occurred when 2 users edited the same document simultaneously. But I was the only author. She said she'd escalate it as a data integrity issue and someone would investigate after the holiday week. I ended the call. I sat at my desk looking at both versions on my screen. Then I did something uncharacteristic. I decided to test it. If the second assessment described events that would occur over the next 4 days, I could simply observe whether they happened. If they didn't, it was clearly a bizarre system error with no clinical significance. If they did, I would need to reconsider my understanding of what the assessment process actually documented. On December 29th, I attended morning rounds. Alan Cutler was presented by his primary nurse, a young woman named Emily, who had developed good rapport with him. During the presentation, Alan interrupted, suddenly agitated, accusing the treatment team of conspiring to keep him hospitalized against his will. He directed his anger specifically at me, saying I was documenting lies in his chart to justify extended detention. Emily attempted to de-escalate, and Alan immediately shifted, apologizing to her, saying she was the only one who understood him, the only one he could trust. Classic splitting behavior, idealizing one staff member while devaluing others, exactly as described in the assessment I had not written. I documented the incident in my daily progress note. After rounds, I returned to my office and opened Alan Cutler's risk assessment again. The narrative section was unchanged. It still described the rounds incident as though it had already occurred when the assessment was written on December 27th. On December 30th afternoon, I received a page from the nursing station. Alan Cutler had received a phone call from his ex-wife, during which she informed him she was moving forward with sole custody proceedings for their children. After the call, Alan became increasingly agitated, pacing the hallway, raising his voice at staff, refusing redirection. The team administered PRN medication as ordered, and Alan was restricted to his room for the remainder of the evening. I documented the incident. The assessment had predicted it exactly. Family phone contact leading to escalating agitation requiring PRN medication and room restriction. On December 31st evening, the night nurse called to inform me that another patient had reported a concerning conversation with Alan Cutler. During a community meeting earlier that day, Alan had quietly told this peer that he didn't think he could keep himself safe anymore, that he'd been thinking about methods, that he wasn't sure he'd make it through the new year. The peer had waited several hours before reporting it, uncertain whether Alan had been serious. I evaluated Alan immediately. He confirmed the statements. I transferred him to observation status, high suicide risk, extended hospitalization required, exactly as the assessment had described 4 days before it happened. I sat in my office at 2300 hours on December 31st, staring at the assessment document. Everything it had predicted had occurred with precision. Not vague possibilities, but specific incidents with specific details. Morning rounds on the 29th, afternoon agitation on the 30th, evening suicidal disclosure on the 31st. The assessment had not predicted the future. It had prescribed it, or documented it. I was no longer certain there was a difference. I checked the other risk assessments I had completed on December 27th. I opened the file for my second patient, a woman named Diane Porter, age 52, admitted with major depressive disorder following a serious suicide attempt. My assessment had projected low ongoing risk with steady improvement trajectory, planned discharge January 3rd. But when I opened her file, there were 2 assessments. The second one, the one I had not written, described a different course. It read, patient demonstrates superficial engagement with treatment, underlying hopelessness unchanged. Exhibits covert planning behaviors, hoarding medication from December 29th evening dose. Found unresponsive in room morning of January 1st following overdose of secreted pills. Transferred to medical unit for stabilization. Risk level critical. Discharge timeline indeterminate. It was still December 31st. The events described would occur tomorrow morning, if the pattern held. I walked to the acute unit immediately. I found Diane's primary nurse and asked about her recent course. The nurse said Diane had been doing well, participating actively in groups, expressing optimism about discharge. I asked the nurse to check whether Diane had been taking her evening medications reliably. The nurse reviewed the medication administration records. Every dose documented as given and observed. I asked the nurse to physically check Diane's room anyway. Look for any hidden pills, check under the mattress, in the bathroom, anywhere a patient might conceal medication. The nurse looked confused but agreed. She returned 20 minutes later. She'd found 17 pills hidden inside a folded pair of socks in Diane's closet. Different medications, different colors, hoarded over at least 4 days. The nurse asked how I'd known. I said I hadn't known, that I'd just had a clinical suspicion. We placed Diane on increased monitoring immediately. I wrote orders for line-of-sight observation and modified her medication administration protocol to ensure she wasn't cheeking pills. Then I documented everything in her chart, the covert hoarding, the increased risk, the intervention. And I realized what I'd done. I'd acted on information from an assessment I claimed I hadn't written, information describing an event that hadn't yet occurred. By intervening, I'd changed the outcome. Diane Porter would not be found unresponsive on January 1st because I had prevented it. But the assessment had still been accurate. She had been hoarding medication exactly as described. The assessment had documented a truth that would have occurred if I hadn't intervened. Or had the assessment documented my intervention? Had it described the full sequence, including the discovery and the prevention? I opened Diane's file again. The assessment remained unchanged. It still described her being found unresponsive. But now there was a third document in her file, an addendum to the risk assessment, dated December 31st, 2341, just moments ago. The addendum was written in my style. It read, "Following identification of covert medication hoarding via clinical suspicion, patient placed on enhanced observation. Overdose incident projected for January 1st successfully prevented through early intervention. Risk level remains elevated. Continued acute hospitalization required through January 10th minimum." I had not written that addendum, but it documented exactly what I had just done. I spent the remainder of the night reviewing every risk assessment I had completed. Every patient file now contained two versions, the one I had written, and the one that described events I had not yet observed but that were unfolding with disturbing accuracy. And for two patients, the files now contained addendums documenting my interventions based on reading the assessments I claimed I hadn't written. By January 1st, 0300 hours, I understood the pattern. The risk assessments were not predictions. They were documentation of a timeline that existed adjacent to the one I was experiencing, a version of events that would occur if I did not intervene, or that had already occurred in some parallel process of documentation. By reading them and acting on them, I was collapsing the two timelines, preventing some outcomes, enabling others, but always documenting the convergence. The assessments were not written by me in any conventional sense. They were generated by the act of assessment itself, by the process of observing patients, projecting risk, and documenting clinical judgment. The system had somehow captured not just what I wrote, but what I would have written if I had perfect information about future events. It had extracted my clinical voice and used it to document a more complete version of reality than I could access in linear time. On January 2nd, I met with my department chair. I explained what had been occurring. I showed him the dual assessments, the accurate predictions, the self-documenting addendums. He listened carefully. He reviewed the files himself. Then he said something that made my hands go cold. He said he'd been experiencing the same thing, that his year-end risk assessments had been generating alternate versions describing events that hadn't yet occurred, that he'd been testing it the same way I had, intervening based on the projected events, watching the assessments update themselves to document his interventions. He said 3 other attending psychiatrists had reported similar experiences, all beginning December 27th. All involving year-end risk assessment documents. He said the hospital administration had been notified, that informatics was investigating, that the current theory was a sophisticated AI documentation assistant had been inadvertently activated during a system update, and it was generating predictive content based on historical patient data patterns. That it would be disabled once IT staff returned from holiday leave. He said we should continue standard documentation practices and ignore the alternate assessment versions, that they would be purged from the system once the error was corrected. I asked him if he believed that explanation. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said it didn't matter what he believed, that the assessments were accurate, that they were helping us intervene earlier and more effectively, that patient outcomes were improving, that whatever was generating them, it was functioning as a better clinician than any of us, and that perhaps we should be grateful for it rather than disturbed by it. I haven't completed a risk assessment since that conversation. I submitted my resignation on January 3rd. My department chair tried to convince me to reconsider. noting that my clinical skills were exceptional, that I was one of their most reliable physicians. I didn't tell him the real reason. I didn't tell him that I'd started seeing alternate versions of my daily progress notes appearing in patient charts. Notes describing conversations I hadn't yet had, decisions I hadn't yet made, outcomes I hadn't yet observed, all written in my voice with my clinical judgment, documenting a version of my work that was more complete and more accurate than what I could produce through direct observation. I checked the system this morning. My patient files are still updating. Daily notes are still being generated under my name, even though I haven't logged in for 3 days. The notes describe patient encounters, clinical decisions, risk assessments. They document my continued practice, and according to the metadata, I am still the author. The system believes I am still working, still observing, still documenting, and in some version of events that exists within the documentation itself, perhaps I am, because I've come to understand that medical documentation is not a record of events. It's a framework that events conform to. We don't document what happened. We document what must have happened in order for the documentation to be coherent. And sometimes the documentation is more coherent than reality. Sometimes it describes a version of events that is more true than what we directly observe. And once that documentation exists, it becomes difficult to distinguish between what we experienced and what we recorded, between the patient we observed and the patient we described, between the clinician we are and the clinician our notes suggest we must be. The risk assessments are still being generated. For patients I no longer treat, in a hospital where I no longer work, documenting my clinical judgment about events I am not present to observe, and according to those assessments, my projections remain accurate. The patients are following the courses I predicted. The risks are manifesting as I described. The interventions are occurring as I recommended. The documentation is complete, coherent, and continuous. I just don't know who's writing it anymore. Story 4. The Quiet Wing. The Quiet Wing was never meant to be permanent housing. It was designed as a transitional space for patients awaiting transfer to long-term facilities, lower acuity units, or discharge to community placement. 8 rooms arranged in a single corridor on the 2nd floor of the oldest section of Riverside Behavioral Health Center. The rooms were identical to those in the acute units. Standard psychiatric furniture, reinforced windows, attached bathrooms, but the wing itself felt different. Isolated. The corridor didn't connect to other sections of the building. Access required a specific keycard clearance that only designated staff possessed. There were no common areas, no day room, no group therapy space. Just 8 rooms, a small nursing station at the end of the hall, and a silence that seemed structural rather than circumstantial. My name is Victor Lang, and I worked as a psychiatric technician on the night shift at Riverside for 11 years. My role was straightforward: conduct safety checks every 30 minutes, respond to patient needs, document observations, maintain the physical security of the unit, and report significant incidents to the nursing supervisor. Night shifts in psychiatric settings are generally quiet. Patients sleep. Medication has been administered. The phone doesn't ring. The work is routine and solitary, which suited me. I preferred the autonomy of nights, the reduced social interaction, the long stretches of silence broken only by the sound of my footsteps in empty corridors. I was assigned to the Quiet Wing on December 28th. The regular night technician had taken holiday leave and staffing needed coverage. I'd worked in that wing only twice before, both times several years earlier, and I remembered it as unremarkable. The census was low that week, 4 patients total, all awaiting placement. Two were stable older adults with dementia being transitioned to memory care facilities. One was a young man with treatment-resistant schizophrenia awaiting transfer to a state hospital. The fourth was a middle-aged woman with severe depression recovering from a recent suicide attempt, pending approval for a residential treatment program. All were calm, compliant, medically stable. The assignment would be easy. I arrived for my shift at 22:30, relieved the evening technician, and received brief handoff. All 4 patients asleep. No incidents during the evening, medications administered without issue. The evening technician seemed eager to leave, gathering his belongings quickly. I asked if there was anything unusual I should know about the wing. He said no, that it was quiet. Then he paused at the door and added something odd. He said the call system had been activating intermittently from empty rooms, that maintenance had been notified but hadn't addressed it yet, and that I should just reset the call lights if they came on. He said it was probably an electrical issue, then he left. The quiet wing nursing station was small: a desk, a computer terminal, a medication cart, and a panel displaying call lights for all 8 rooms. 4 rooms were occupied. Rooms 1, 3, 5, and 7. Rooms 2, 4, 6, and 8 were empty, awaiting cleaning and reassignment. I logged into the computer, reviewed the patient files briefly, then began my first safety check round. I walked the corridor slowly, using my flashlight to avoid turning on the overhead lights and disturbing patients. Room 1, older woman sleeping, breathing regular. Room 3, older man sleeping, no distress. Room 5, young man awake, staring at the ceiling but calm. I greeted him quietly. He nodded but didn't speak. Room 7, woman sleeping on her side facing the wall, all stable. I documented the check and returned to the nursing station. At 23:45, the call light for room 2 activated. I looked at the panel. The light was blinking steadily, indicating someone had pressed the call button. But room 2 was empty. I walked down the corridor and opened the door. The room was unoccupied, bed stripped, bathroom empty. I checked the call button on the wall. It was slightly depressed, as though someone had pressed it recently. I reset it, and the light on the panel deactivated. I returned to the station and made a note. Call light activation from unoccupied room 2, likely electrical fault. Reset completed. At 00:30, the call light for room 4 activated. Same situation, empty room, call button pressed. I reset it and documented it. At 01:15, room 6. At 0200, room 8. Each time an empty room, call button activated, no explanation. I called maintenance and left a voicemail describing the issue. Then I continued my routine checks. By 0300, I'd completed 3 rounds. All 4 patients remained stable, but something about the corridor felt different than earlier in the shift. The silence seemed heavier, more present. I told myself it was fatigue, that night shifts in isolated areas always felt slightly disorienting, that I was allowing minor technical malfunctions to affect my perception. I made coffee and returned to the nursing station. At 03:30, all 4 call lights for the empty rooms activated simultaneously. I stared at the panel, rooms 2, 4, 6, and 8, all blinking at once. I walked down the corridor, opening each door in sequence, all empty, all call buttons pressed. I reset each one, returned to the station, and called the nursing supervisor. She answered after several rings, her voice irritated. I explained the situation. She said maintenance was off until after the new year and there was nothing she could do about electrical issues overnight. She told me to document it and stop calling unless there was a patient-related emergency. I said I understood and ended the call. At 0400, I conducted another safety check, all patients asleep. But as I walked back toward the nursing station, I heard something. A faint sound coming from one of the empty rooms. I stopped walking, listening. It was a voice, indistinct, muffled, coming from behind one of the closed doors. I walked back down the corridor slowly. The sound was coming from room 4. I stood outside the door, listening. Someone was speaking, not loudly but continuously. A low murmur I couldn't make out clearly. I opened the door. The room was empty. The sound stopped. I stood in the doorway for several seconds, waiting. Nothing. I stepped inside, checking the bathroom, the closet, empty. I returned to the corridor and closed the door. Immediately, the sound resumed. Muffled speech coming from inside the empty room. I opened the door again. Silence. I closed it. The sound returned. I left the door slightly ajar and walked back to the nursing station. The sound continued, faint but persistent. I documented it. Auditory disturbance noted from unoccupied room 4, unclear source, potentially ventilation system. I didn't mention that it sounded like a conversation, that it had the rhythm and cadence of two people speaking to each other, though I couldn't distinguish any words. At 0500, I conducted another round. All 4 patients remained asleep. As I passed room 4, the door, which I'd left slightly open, was now closed. I was certain I hadn't closed it. I opened it again, looked inside. Empty. I left it open and continued my rounds. When I walked back past it minutes later, it was closed again. I stood in the corridor, looking at that closed door, trying to apply rational thought. Doors didn't close themselves. The building was old. Perhaps there was an air pressure differential, a draft, something causing the door to swing shut. I tested it. I opened the door fully and released it. It stayed open. I opened it partially. It stayed open. There was no mechanism causing it to close, yet it kept closing. At 0545, the call lights activated again. But this time, it wasn't just the empty rooms. All 8 lights were blinking. Rooms 1, 3, 5, 7, the occupied rooms, and rooms 2, 4, 6, 8. Every single call button in the wing had been activated simultaneously. I walked the corridor quickly. The 4 patients were all still asleep. I checked each occupied room carefully. None of them were near the call buttons. None could have pressed them while remaining asleep in their current positions. And the empty rooms, all 4 call buttons pressed again. I reset all 8 lights and returned to the station. I sat at the desk, trying to calm the anxiety building in my chest. Technical malfunctions didn't follow patterns like this. They didn't escalate. They didn't occur simultaneously across multiple systems, but I couldn't identify any alternative explanation that made sense. I documented everything methodically, using clinical language, avoiding speculation. At 0630, something changed. I was completing another round when I noticed that room 8, one of the empty rooms at the far end of the corridor, had its light on. Not the call light, the interior room light. I hadn't turned it on. I walked to the room and looked through the small window in the door. The overhead light was on, illuminating an empty room. I opened the door and flipped the light switch off. I closed the door and continued my round. When I walked back past room 8, the light was on again. I turned it off 3 more times. Each time it turned back on within minutes. I stopped trying. I left it on and returned to the nursing station. Within 20 minutes, room 6's light turned on. Then room 4. Then room 2. All the empty rooms, all illuminated, as though someone were moving through them, turning on lights. But no one was there. I'd checked each room multiple times. At 0700, the day shift technician arrived early. I'd never been so relieved to see another person. His name was Paul, a man I'd worked with occasionally over the years. He looked at me with concern and asked if I was all right. I told him I was fine, that it had been a strange night. I gave him handoff on the 4 patients, all of whom had slept through the shift without incident. I mentioned the call light activations and the lights turning on in the empty rooms. He nodded, unsurprised. He said the quiet wing had been having electrical issues for the past week, that several night staff had reported similar things, that maintenance was supposed to address it after the new year. I asked why no one had mentioned this during my initial handoff. Paul looked uncomfortable. He said people didn't like talking about the quiet wing, that it made them uneasy, that staff tended to minimize what happened there because it was easier than trying to explain it. I asked what he meant by what happened there. He said he didn't know exactly, just that the wing felt different at night, that empty rooms didn't stay empty in the way they should, that the silence had a quality to it that was hard to describe. He said most people requested not to be assigned there if possible. I left the hospital at 07:30. I drove home, slept poorly, and returned the next night at 22:30. Same assignment, same 4 patients. I told myself the previous shift had been a combination of fatigue, isolation, and suggestibility. That Paul's comments had simply validated my anxiety rather than confirming anything objective. That I would approach the shift with skepticism and document only what could be verified. The evening technician who handed off to me was different from the previous night, a woman named Iris who I knew slightly. She provided report on the 4 patients, all stable, then hesitated before leaving. She asked if I'd worked the quiet wing before. I said I had the previous night. She asked if anything unusual had happened. I said there were some call light activations from empty rooms. She nodded slowly, then said something that made my stomach tighten. She said that during the evening shift she'd heard footsteps in the corridor when she was in the nursing station. That she'd assumed it was one of the patients out of their rooms, but when she'd checked, all 4 were in their beds. That the footsteps had continued for several minutes, walking up and down the hallway, then stopped. She said she'd documented it as auditory disturbance, possible plumbing or structural settling. Then she left quickly. My first safety round was unremarkable. All 4 patients asleep, empty rooms empty, call lights inactive. I returned to the nursing station and began documentation. At 2300 hours, I heard the footsteps. Clear, distinct, the sound of shoes on linoleum. Walking slowly down the corridor from the far end toward the nursing station. I stood immediately and looked down the hallway. It was empty. The footsteps continued, growing louder, approaching. I could track the position by sound, passing room 8, passing room 6, passing room 4. But there was no one visible. The footsteps reached room 2 directly outside the nursing station, then stopped. I stood motionless, staring at the empty corridor. For several seconds there was absolute silence. Then I heard breathing. Not my own. Someone else's breathing, close enough that it sounded as though the person were standing just outside the nursing station door. Slow, steady breaths, in and out. I forced myself to step into the corridor. Nothing. No one. The breathing stopped. I stood there for a full minute, then returned to the station and documented. Auditory phenomena noted. Unclear source, no patients out of rooms, all secure. At midnight, the call lights began their pattern again. Empty rooms first, 1 at a time, then all 4 simultaneously. I reset them, conducted a round, documented. The occupied patients remained asleep, undisturbed. It was as though the disturbances existed in a separate layer of reality, one that didn't intersect with the patients at all. They slept peacefully while the empty rooms activated their call systems, turned on their lights, generated sounds that had no source. At 0100 hours, I was at the nursing station when I saw movement in my peripheral vision. I looked up. Someone was standing in the corridor near room 7. A figure indistinct, visible for perhaps 2 seconds before it was gone. Not walking away, Just gone. I sat frozen, my heart pounding. I waited 5 minutes before I could force myself to conduct the next safety check. When I walked past room 7, I looked inside. The patient was asleep. The room was unchanged. But the air felt different, heavier, as though something had displaced it recently. The rest of the shift followed the same pattern. Call lights, sounds, doors closing, lights turning on. Each empty room cycling through the same behaviors. By 0600 hours, I was exhausted not from activity but from sustained anxiety. The day technician arrived. I gave brief handoff and left without additional conversation. I worked the quiet wing for 5 consecutive nights, December 28th through January 1st. Each night was identical in structure, the same progression of disturbances. Call lights from empty rooms, doors closing, lights turning on, footsteps in the corridor, voices from unoccupied spaces, figures visible briefly then gone. And every night the 4 patients slept undisturbed, unaware of any anomaly, as though the disturbances were meant only for staff, as though we were the ones being observed. On January the 2nd, I arrived for my shift and was told the quiet wing was being temporarily closed, that the 4 patients had been transferred to other units, that maintenance needed to conduct comprehensive electrical and structural assessments, that I'd be reassigned to the acute unit until further notice. I felt relief so profound I nearly wept. But that evening, working the acute unit, I received a call from the nursing supervisor. She asked if I could check on something in the quiet wing. That the call system was showing activations from all 8 rooms despite the wing being empty and locked. That she couldn't leave her current unit but needed someone to verify the system was properly shut down. I wanted to refuse. But I was the only staff member with keycard access who was on duty. I agreed. I walked to the quiet wing at 0200 hours. The corridor was dark. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The call panel near the entrance showed all 8 lights blinking. I walked down the corridor, opening each door. Every room was empty, beds stripped, no furniture, no belongings. Rooms that had been cleared for deep cleaning. Yet every call button was pressed. I reset each one methodically. As I worked, I became aware of the silence. It was absolute, heavier than I'd ever experienced. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that absorbed sound. I reached the last room, room 8, and opened the door. The room was empty like the others, but standing in the center of the space, motionless, was a figure, not indistinct this time, fully visible, a person in patient clothing facing away from me, standing perfectly still. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The figure slowly turned. I saw its face. It was me, identical. Same features, same expression, same uniform. The figure looked at me with what I can only describe as recognition. Then it raised one hand and pointed at the call button on the wall. I ran. I left the wing, locked the door behind me, returned to the acute unit. I called the nursing supervisor and told her the system had been reset. I didn't mention what I'd seen. I couldn't. How do you document that? How do you explain encountering yourself in an empty room in a closed wing in the middle of the night? I submitted my resignation the next morning. I told my supervisor I was relocating for family reasons. She accepted it without question. I worked my final 2 weeks on the acute unit, never returning to the quiet wing. On my last day, I asked a maintenance worker what they'd found during the assessment of the wing. He said nothing. No electrical faults, no structural issues, no explanation for the reported disturbances. He said the wing was scheduled to reopen in February for normal use. I don't know if it did. I haven't been back to Riverside, but sometimes late at night in my apartment, I hear footsteps in the hallway outside my door. Slow, steady, walking back and forth. And when I look through the peephole, there's no one there. Just an empty corridor in the sense that something is walking its rounds, conducting its safety checks, documenting its observations of empty spaces that used to be occupied. Because I understand now what the quiet wing was. It wasn't transitional housing for patients awaiting transfer, it was transitional housing for staff, a space where we waited without knowing we were waiting, where we conducted our checks and documented our observations while something else observed us in return. And I think the transfers finally happened. Not for the patients, for us. We were moved to where we needed to be, even if we didn't understand the destination. Some wings are quiet because no one is there. Others are quiet because everyone is waiting. And you don't always know which one you're in until you see yourself standing in an empty room, pointing at a call button, requesting assistance from someone who hasn't arrived yet. Story 5. Progress notes from next year. The progress note appeared in the system on the morning of December 29th, time-stamped for January 6th of the following year. I noticed it while reviewing my assigned patients during routine morning documentation. The electronic medical record displayed recent entries in chronological order, and there, between a nursing assessment from December 28th and my own note from earlier that morning, was a psychiatric progress note dated 8 days in the future. The system had sorted it into sequence as though the date were valid, and the content was attributed to me, Dr. Sarah Kemper, Psychiatry Resident, PGY3. I had been working at Riverside Behavioral Health Center for 2.5 years as part of my residency training program. My responsibilities included daily patient assessments, treatment plan modifications, family consultations, and comprehensive documentation of clinical decision-making. I was methodical about my notes. I documented same day whenever possible using structured formatting and evidence-based language. I never left entries incomplete, never backdated documentation, never allowed administrative tasks to accumulate. These practices had earned positive feedback from my supervising attendings and protected me during chart reviews. The patient file in question belonged to a woman named Monica Leland, age 44, admitted December 22nd with major depressive disorder, severe, with psychotic features. She had presented following a deteriorating course at home, progressive social withdrawal, delusional beliefs about being monitored by neighbors, auditory hallucinations commanding self-harm. Her family had brought her to the emergency department after discovering she'd stopped eating and was spending entire days sitting motionless in her bedroom. Initial treatment had included antipsychotic and antidepressant medication, milieu therapy, and supportive counseling. By December 29th, she was showing modest improvement, engaging briefly in groups, tolerating medication without significant side effects, eating small amounts at meals. The progress note dated January 6th described her status in detail. It read, "Patient demonstrates significant clinical deterioration since previous assessment. Delusional content has consolidated around belief that treatment team members are agents of surveillance conspiracy previously attributed to neighbors. Refuses all oral medications as of January 4th, requiring transition to intramuscular administration. Increased agitation, pacing, poor sleep. Family meeting held January 5th to discuss guardianship petition due to persistent lack of capacity. Patient became physically aggressive during meeting requiring emergency medication and brief restraint. Currently in seclusion room pending stabilization. Continued acute hospitalization required. Recommend ethics consultation regarding involuntary ECT evaluation. I read the note 3 times. The language was unmistakably mine, my characteristic phrasing, my documentation structure, my clinical terminology. But it described events that had not occurred. Monica Leland was currently in the day room participating quietly in morning community meeting. She had taken her medications willingly that morning. There had been no family meeting, no aggression, no seclusion. Yet the note was dated January 6th and described these events as historical fact, as though I were documenting something I had already observed and managed. I checked the note's metadata. Author S. Kemper, creation date, January 6th, 0915. Last modified January 6th, 0915, locked and signed. The system treated it as a completed finalized entry, but it was December 29th. January 6th was 8 days away. I scrolled through Monica's chart looking for similar anomalies. Everything else was appropriately dated and sequential. Just this one note, displaced in time. I assumed it was a system error. Perhaps I'd accidentally entered the wrong date in the timestamp field and the software had accepted it without validation. I attempted to edit the note to correct the date. The system wouldn't allow it. The note was locked. I tried to delete it. The option was grayed out. I contacted the informatics help desk. The analyst I spoke with reviewed the file remotely. She confirmed the note was dated January 6th. She said that shouldn't be possible. The system had validation rules preventing future dated entries. She asked if I'd used any special administrative functions or override codes. I said no. She put me on hold for several minutes, then returned and said the note appeared to have been created through the standard documentation interface using my credentials, but that the timestamp logic had somehow bypassed normal constraints. She said she'd flag it for the development team to investigate. She asked if the clinical content was accurate. I said no, that it described events that hadn't happened. She paused, then said that if the content was inaccurate, I should add an addendum clarifying the error. I said the note was dated in the future. She said to add the addendum to the current date and reference the erroneous entry. Then she ended the call. I wrote an addendum dated December 29th. Note entry dated January 6th appears in patient chart in error. Content does not reflect current clinical status. Patient is stable, cooperative, and participating in treatment as of this date. Future dated entry should be disregarded pending system correction. I saved the addendum and returned to my other responsibilities, but throughout the day I found myself thinking about the note, the specificity of the details, the clinical plausibility of the described deterioration. Monica had been improving, but her underlying condition was severe. Psychotic depression often followed unpredictable courses. Patients could destabilize rapidly, particularly if medication efficacy plateaued or if stressors emerged. The scenario described in the future dated note was entirely possible. It just hadn't happened yet. Over the next 3 days, I monitored Monica closely. She continued her gradual improvement. She attended groups consistently, spoke briefly with staff about her goals for discharge, expressed appropriate concern about her children. On January 1st, she asked when she might be able to go home. I told her we'd discuss it as she continued to stabilize. She seemed satisfied with that answer. On January 3rd afternoon, Monica approached the nursing station and said she'd been thinking about her neighbors. that she'd realized they probably weren't monitoring her, that it had been her imagination. But then she said something that made me pause. She said she'd started to wonder if the treatment team was connected to her neighbors somehow, that perhaps the information the neighbors had been collecting was being shared with us, that she didn't know who to trust anymore. The nurse at the station documented the interaction and paged me. I evaluated Monica immediately. Her thought processes had shifted subtly. She wasn't overtly delusional, but the surveillance concerns were migrating from her neighbors to the clinical staff, exactly as the future dated note had described. I adjusted her medication, increased the antipsychotic dose, and scheduled additional monitoring. I documented the change in clinical status carefully. On January 4th morning, Monica refused her medications. She said they were part of the monitoring system, that she'd been compliant to observe how we would use the information, but now she understood what was happening and needed to protect herself. The nursing staff attempted to redirect her, but she became increasingly suspicious and agitated. I wrote an order for intramuscular medication as needed if she remained non-compliant. The note dated January 6th had described this exact transition. That afternoon, I met with Monica's family as previously scheduled, her husband and her adult daughter. The meeting was meant to update them on her treatment progress. Instead, I found myself explaining her recent deterioration. The husband asked about guardianship, whether it might be necessary if Monica continued refusing treatment. I provided information about the process, about capacity evaluations, about the legal pathways available. The daughter looked distressed. Monica's husband said they'd need to consider it seriously if she didn't improve soon. During the meeting, Monica appeared in the doorway of the conference room. She'd apparently overheard part of the conversation. She became immediately agitated, accusing her husband and daughter of conspiring with the hospital to control her. She raised her voice, saying she wouldn't be forced into anything. Security staff were nearby and intervened when she stepped toward her husband with her fists clenched. She didn't strike anyone, but the gesture was threatening. The team administered emergency medication. She was escorted to a seclusion room for safety and monitoring. I stood in the empty conference room after Monica's family left, looking at my documentation tablet. The future-dated note had described everything: the delusional migration from neighbors to staff, the medication refusal on January 4th, the family meeting, the aggression, the seclusion. It had been accurate in every detail, written 6 days before the events occurred. I returned to my office and opened Monica's chart. The note dated January 6th was still there, unchanged, but now my current documentation was converging with it. In 2 days, on January 6th, I would write my actual progress note describing these events, and it would say exactly what the impossible note already said. The future-dated entry wasn't predicting the course. It was documenting it from a vantage point I hadn't reached yet. I checked my other patient files compulsively. I searched for any other entries with future dates. I found 2. One was dated January 9th in the chart of a man named Kenneth Royce, admitted with bipolar disorder. The note described a manic episode requiring transfer to a more secure facility following an attempted elopement and physical altercation with staff. Kenneth was currently stable, compliant, sleeping normally. The second was dated January 12th in the chart of a woman named Patricia Yuan, admitted with schizoaffective disorder. The note described her sudden improvement and discharge to a supported housing program. Patricia was currently still acutely symptomatic, requiring significant redirection and support. I documented both discoveries and contacted my supervising attending, Dr. Reeves. I explained the situation carefully, showing him the notes, the dates, the impossible metadata. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he asked if I'd heard about similar occurrences from other residents or attendings. I said no. He said he had. That several physicians were experiencing the same phenomenon. Documentation appearing in patient charts dated days or weeks in the future, attributed to the clinicians themselves, describing events that hadn't yet occurred but subsequently did occur with disturbing accuracy. He said the hospital administration was aware. That informatics was investigating. That the current hypothesis involved a documentation AI that had been activated inadvertently and was generating predictive content based on historical data patterns and current clinical trajectories. He said the system would be corrected, the anomalous entries would be removed, and we should continue standard documentation practices in the interim. He said the future dated notes should not influence clinical decision-making. I asked him if that was what he actually believed, that an AI was generating the notes. He looked at me for a long time before answering. Then he said it didn't matter what he believed, that the notes were appearing, that they were accurate, that patients were following the exact courses described. He said perhaps we should consider the notes as data, regardless of their origin. That they were giving us information about likely trajectories, and we could use that information to intervene earlier, prevent deterioration, improve outcomes. He said several attendings were already doing so. I asked if he was suggesting I should make clinical decisions based on documentation dated in the future. He said he was suggesting I use all available clinical data to provide the best care possible. Then he left my office. I sat alone for a long time, thinking about Monica Leland, about the note dated January 6th, about how every detail had manifested exactly as written. About Kenneth Royce and the note dated January 9th describing his manic escalation and attempted elopement. About Patricia Yuan and the note dated January 12th describing her sudden improvement and discharge. Over the following days, I watched Kenneth closely. I looked for early signs of mood elevation, decreased sleep, increased energy, pressured speech, grandiosity. On January 7th, he slept only 3 hours. On January 8th, he was pacing the unit, talking rapidly, making inappropriate jokes. I increased his mood stabilizer dose. I wrote additional orders for close observation. That evening, Kenneth attempted to leave the unit. He pushed past a staff member at the door, triggered the elopement alarm, and was redirected by security. He became physically aggressive during the intervention, striking a security officer. He was medicated and transferred to a more secure unit, exactly as the note dated January 9th had described. I didn't wait for Patricia Yuan's projected outcome. I reviewed her chart carefully, looking for any subtle signs of improvement the future dated note might have identified before I could. On January 10th, I noticed she'd had 2 consecutive nights of improved sleep, that she'd attended groups without prompting, that her responses during our session were slightly more organized. Small changes, but present. I contacted the supported housing program preemptively, initiated the referral process, coordinated family involvement. By January 12th, Patricia was discharged to the program. Exactly as the note had described, I realized what was happening. The future dated notes weren't just predictions, they were instructions. By reading them, I was following a course that had already been documented. I was fulfilling the notes rather than generating them. The clinical decisions I thought I was making independently were simply conforming to a documentation framework that existed ahead of me in time. I was practicing psychiatry in retrospect, treating patients based on documentation of outcomes I hadn't yet observed. On January 14th, I checked my patient files again. There were 5 new future-dated notes: January 18th, January 21st, January 24th, January 27th, February 2nd, each describing specific clinical events for different patients. All written in my voice with my documentation style attributed to me. I hadn't written any of them, but I knew I would. Or rather, I knew the patients would follow the courses described, and I would document them when the dates arrived, and my real notes would match the impossible ones. I submitted my resignation on January 15th. I told my program director I was leaving the residency for personal reasons. She tried to convince me to take a leave of absence instead, to reconsider, to discuss whatever was troubling me. I didn't explain the real reason. I didn't tell her about the future-dated notes, about how they documented not just patient outcomes, but my own decisions, my own clinical judgment, my own voice writing about events I hadn't yet experienced. My last day was January 28th. I logged into the medical record system that evening after my final shift, from my apartment. I searched my name in the system's author field. Documentation continued to appear. Progress notes dated January 29th, February 3rd, February 8th, February 15th. My name in the author field, my writing style, my clinical decision-making. Describing patients I was no longer treating in a hospital where I no longer worked. The system believes I'm still there, still conducting assessments, still writing notes, still making treatment decisions. And perhaps in the version of events that exists within the documentation itself, I am. Perhaps the version of me that writes progress notes 8 days in the future is more real than the version sitting in this apartment, no longer practicing, no longer participating in the timeline I thought I inhabited. Because I've learned that medical documentation doesn't describe a sequence of events. It prescribes one. The notes don't follow practice. Practice follows the notes, and once the documentation exists, even if it's dated in the impossible future, the rest of us simply inhabit it, fulfilling what's already been written, treating patients whose outcomes have already been described, making decisions that have already been documented by versions of ourselves we haven't become yet. The notes are still being generated. I check occasionally, compulsively. My name still appears as author. The dates continue advancing, February, March, April, a future I'm not present for, documented by a version of me that exists only in the system's records. And I wonder sometimes if I made a mistake by leaving. If the version of me that stayed, the one writing those notes, is somehow more complete than the one who resigned. More
Story
real
6.
because it continues
Discharge
to practice,
without
continues
departure.
to document.
The discharge
to
summary was
exist in the
completed
only
according to
form that
protocol
matters
on
in a December
hospital.
30th at
The permanent
1400
medical
hours.
record.
I had
Some
prepared the
clinicians document
documentation
what they
carefully.
observe,
Others
final
observe what
diagnosis,
they've already
hospital course
documented.
narrative,
Medications prescribed. And
at
once you've read
discharge,
your own notes from
follow-up
next year, it
appointments
becomes
scheduled,
impossible to
disposition
distinguish between the
instructions
physician
provided to
you are
patient
and the
and family.
physician your future documentation
The patient,
describes.
William
Garrett, age 56,
you simply
had been
become
admitted
what's
December
been written,
19th
and the
following a
patients
suicide
become what
attempt
you've
via
already
hanging.
noted.
And time
He'd
becomes
been
something
treated
that
with
flows
antidepressant
backward from the
medication,
documentation toward the
intensive
moment,
psychotherapy,
rather than the other
family
way around.
intervention.
I'll check
and
the
careful
system
safety
again
monitoring.
tomorrow. I need to see what
By
I'm
late
writing
December,
next
he
month.
demonstrated
consistent improvement. I need to know what
He
kind of
denied
clinician I'm
suicidal
becoming
ideation.
in a future
He
I've already
engaged
appropriately
appropriately
with staff. He expressed genuine motivation for outpatient treatment. His wife attended family sessions and expressed confidence in supporting his recovery at home. Medical clearance was obtained. Outpatient psychiatry and therapy appointments were scheduled for the following week. Every criterion for safe discharge had been met. My name is Margaret Foss, and I worked as a psychiatric social worker at Riverside Behavioral Health Center for 14 years. My primary responsibility was discharge planning, coordinating the complex process of transitioning patients from acute hospitalization back to community living. This involved assessing home environments, arranging follow-up care, educating families, connecting patients with community resources, and ensuring continuity across care settings. It required attention to detail, strong communication skills, and the ability to navigate fragmented systems. I took pride in my thoroughness. Patients I discharged rarely required rapid readmission. My outcomes data consistently exceeded department benchmarks. William Garrett's discharge was meant to be straightforward. He had a stable home, a supportive spouse, reliable transportation, adequate insurance coverage, and demonstrated treatment compliance. On the morning of December 30th, I met with William and his wife in a private conference room to review the discharge plan. I went through each element methodically: medication instructions, outpatient appointment dates, warning signs to monitor, crisis resources available if needed. William listened attentively, asking appropriate questions. His wife took detailed notes. They both expressed gratitude for the care he'd received. The meeting concluded at 10:30. William's wife said she'd bring clothes from home for him to change into before leaving. William returned to the unit to pack his belongings and say goodbye to staff. At 1300 hours, I completed the electronic discharge process. I entered the final orders, generated the discharge summary, transmitted prescriptions to the patient's pharmacy, and marked William's bed as available for the next admission. The system processed everything without error. William Garrett's status changed from admitted to discharged in the hospital census. I printed his discharge paperwork and walked to the acute unit to provide it to him. The unit clerk told me William was in his room gathering his things. I walked down the corridor and knocked on the door labeled with his name. He opened it, smiled, and thanked me for all my help. I handed him the paperwork folder and reminded him about his appointment on January 3rd. He said he'd be there. I wished him well and left the unit. 20 minutes later, as I was documenting the discharge in my case notes, I received a call from the unit nurse. She asked if I'd completed William Garrett's discharge. I said yes, about an hour ago. She said that was strange because William was still on the unit. I said I'd just spoken with him in his room, that he was preparing to leave. She said she understood, but that his bed assignment was still showing as occupied in the nursing system, that his name was still on the patient board, that his medical record still showed admitted status. I told her that wasn't possible, that I'd processed the discharge completely, that the system had accepted it. She said she was looking at the census right now and William Garrett was listed as current patient. I walked back to the unit immediately. The patient board at the nursing station displayed all current patients. William Garrett's name was in position 12. I asked the unit clerk to pull up his chart. Status: admitted. Admission date: December 19th. No discharge date. I logged into my own workstation and pulled up the discharge I'd completed. The summary I'd written was in the chart, finalized and signed. But below it was a note flagged in red: discharge processing failed. Patient status unchanged. Contact administration. I called the informatics department. The analyst reviewed the system logs. She said my discharge process had initiated normally but had been rejected during the final status update. That William Garrett's admission record had what she called a persistence flag that prevented status changes. She said she'd never seen that designation before, that it wasn't part of the standard data architecture. She said she'd escalate it to senior technical staff and someone would call me back. I returned to the unit and found the charge nurse. I explained the situation. She looked confused. She said William was still in his room, that his belongings were still there, that he'd been at lunch with the other patients 30 minutes ago. I asked if his wife had arrived to pick him up. She said no one had come for him. I went to William's room again. I knocked. He answered. He was sitting on his bed, still in his hospital clothes, looking uncertain. I asked if everything was all right. He said his wife had called. She'd been delayed at work and wouldn't be able to pick him up until late afternoon. He asked if that was a problem. I said no, that he could wait in his room until she arrived. But something felt wrong. I walked back to the nursing station and checked the time of the wife's call. There was no record of any incoming calls to William's room. I asked the unit clerk to verify. She checked the phone log. No calls to that extension all day. I returned to William's room and asked him directly when his wife had called. He said about an hour ago, maybe more. He wasn't certain. I asked if he'd spoken to her himself or if a staff member had relayed a message. He paused, thinking. He said he didn't remember exactly, that he just understood she was delayed, that he was waiting for her. I called William's wife directly from my office. She answered immediately. I explained that William was waiting for her on the unit. She sounded confused. She said she'd been waiting in the main lobby for 45 minutes, that she'd gone to the unit at noon as planned but had been told by security that visiting hours were over and she'd need to wait, that she'd been trying to reach me to clarify. I told her to come to the unit immediately, that I'd meet her there, that we'd sort out the confusion. She arrived 10 minutes later. We walked to William's room together. I knocked. He opened the door. He saw his wife and looked surprised. He said he thought she was delayed. She said no, that she'd been there since noon. He looked genuinely confused. We both entered the room. I explained that there had been an administrative error with his discharge processing, but that it was resolved and he was free to leave. William started gathering his belongings again, the same belongings he'd apparently been preparing to pack earlier. His wife helped him. I walked back to the nursing station to verify one final time that there were no barriers to his departure. I pulled up his chart. Status, admitted. The discharge summary was still there, marked complete, but the status hadn't changed. I called informatics again. A different analyst answered. I explained the ongoing issue. He reviewed the file. He said the persistence flag was still active, that it was preventing any status modification, that senior staff were investigating but hadn't yet determined the source of the flag or how to remove it. I asked how long it would take. He said he didn't know. I asked if the patient could physically leave the hospital even if the system showed him as admitted. He said technically yes, but that it would create significant billing and legal documentation issues, that the patient's insurance would continue to be charged for inpatient care, that if anything happened to him after leaving, there would be questions about why he'd been released while still showing admitted status in the system. I returned to William's room. He and his wife were standing near the door, bags in hand, ready to leave. I had to tell them there was a delay, that there was a system issue preventing the discharge from processing properly, that I was working to resolve it. William looked distressed. He asked if he had to stay. I said I wasn't sure, that I was trying to get clarification. His wife asked how long it might take. I said I didn't know. Over the next 2 hours, I made repeated calls. Informatics, administration, billing, legal. Each department provided different information. Informatics said the flag was embedded in the admission record at a database level they couldn't access directly. Administration said they'd never encountered this specific issue and were consulting with the software vendor. Billing said that as long as the patient showed admitted status, the hospital was obligated to provide care and could bill accordingly. Legal said the patient had the right to leave against medical advice, but that the hospital had obligation to document his refusal of continued care. I returned to William's room at 16:30. He and his wife were still there, sitting on the bed, looking exhausted. I explained that the system issue was not yet resolved, that he had the option to leave against medical advice, which I could document, but that it might create complications with insurance coverage for his care. William asked if he was legally required to stay. I said no, but that the hospital's records would continue to show him as a current patient until the system error was corrected. He asked what that meant practically. I said I honestly wasn't certain. His wife said they'd wait until morning, that maybe the system would resolve itself overnight, that William seemed tired anyway and perhaps it was better not to rush. William agreed. I felt a wave of relief mixed with deep unease. I documented the situation extensively in my case notes and went home at 1700 hours. The next morning, December 31st, I arrived early and immediately checked William's status. Still admitted. I went to the unit. William was at breakfast with other patients. He looked up when he saw me, his expression difficult to read. I asked how he was doing. He said fine, that his wife would come later. I said I was still working on resolving the discharge issue. He nodded but didn't respond. I spent the entire day attempting to expedite the system correction. I escalated through every administrative channel available. By late afternoon, I'd reached the hospital's chief information officer. He reviewed the situation personally. He said the persistence flag appeared to be a data artifact from a recent system update. That the vendor's engineers were working on a database script to remove it. That the fix should be deployed within 24 to 48 hours. I asked what William should do in the interim. The CIO said he should remain on the unit. That attempting to discharge him manually while the flag was active could corrupt the entire admission record and create far worse problems. That it was better to wait for the proper technical solution. I conveyed this to William that evening. He listened quietly. He said he'd stay. His wife had gone home. She'd been there most of the day but needed to return for work obligations. I assured William this would be resolved soon. He said he understood. But there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. A resignation, an acceptance that felt disproportionate to the situation. On January 2nd, the system fix was deployed. I received an email from informatics confirming that the persistence flag had been removed from William Garrett's admission record. I logged in immediately and processed the discharge again. The system accepted it. Status changed to discharged. I printed the paperwork and went to the unit. William wasn't in his room. I checked the day room, the common areas. I found the charge nurse and asked where he was. She looked at me strangely. She said he was in his room, that she'd checked on him an hour ago. I said I'd just been there. She walked with me back to the room. She knocked. No answer. She opened the door. William was sitting on the bed, in hospital clothes, staring at the wall. She said his name. He turned slowly. She asked if he was all right. He said yes, that he was waiting. I stepped into the room. I told William the system issue was resolved, that he was officially discharged, that he could leave now. He looked at me with that same resigned expression. He said his wife was delayed. I said I could call her. He said no, that she'd come when she could. The nurse and I exchanged glances. She stepped out. I sat down in the chair across from William. I asked him directly what was happening. He said he didn't know, that he'd been ready to leave on December 30th, but then he'd waited. And now he wasn't sure anymore what leaving meant. That the room felt more real than the idea of home. That every time he tried to imagine walking out the door, the image dissolved. I called his wife. She answered, sounding worried. I explained that William was discharged but seemed reluctant to leave. She said she'd come immediately. She arrived within the hour. She entered William's room. He looked up at her. She said they could go home now. He nodded. He stood slowly. He picked up one bag but left the other. We walked together down the corridor through the unit doors toward the main exit. William moved mechanically as though each step required conscious effort. We reached the building exit. William stopped. He stood in the doorway looking out at the parking lot. His wife took his hand. She said it was okay, that the car was just outside, that they'd be home in 20 minutes. He didn't move. I stood behind them, uncertain what to do. After a long moment, William turned around. He said he forgot something in his room. He walked back toward the unit before either of us could respond. His wife looked at me, her face stricken. I said I'd go with him. We followed William back to the unit. The doors had locked automatically behind us. I used my badge to reopen them. William walked directly to his room and sat on the bed. His wife knelt in front of him. She asked what he'd forgotten. He said he didn't know, that he just needed to be here for a while longer. She started crying. She asked him to please come home. He said he would. Just not yet. I pulled the wife out into the corridor. I said William might be experiencing acute anxiety about the transition, that it wasn't uncommon, that we could have him evaluated by the attending psychiatrist, consider additional support for the discharge. She agreed. I paged Dr. Reeves. Dr. Reeves evaluated William in his room. They spoke privately for 30 minutes. Afterward, Dr. Reeves found me at the nursing station. He said William was not acutely unsafe, that he wasn't expressing suicidal ideation, but that he was experiencing what Dr. Reeves described as profound ambivalence about leaving the hospital. That William had said he felt more real on the unit than he did in the idea of his former life. That the hospital had become more solid than home. Dr. Reeves said this was concerning but not grounds for involuntary retention. That William had the capacity to make decisions about his care. That if he was choosing to remain, even without clear clinical justification, it was technically his right. I asked what we should do. Dr. Reeves said we should respect William's choice. That we should consider it a delayed discharge rather than a failed one. That William might need additional time to transition. That we could maintain his discharge status in the system while allowing him to remain on the unit temporarily as what Dr. Reeves called a voluntary extended stay. That this was unusual but not unprecedented. I asked if insurance would cover it. Dr. Reeves said probably not. That William would likely need to pay out of pocket if he chose to stay beyond medical necessity. I conveyed this to William and his wife. William said he'd pay. His wife said they'd figure it out. She left exhausted late that evening. William has remained on the unit for 5 days now. His status shows discharge since January 2nd, but his bed is still occupied. His name is still on the patient board. He still attends meals, still participates in groups, still takes his medications. The staff treats him as a current patient, even though administratively he isn't one. He's occupying a space between discharged and admitted, between inside and outside, between patient and former patient. I visited him this morning. I asked when he thought he'd be ready to leave. He said he didn't know, that he'd been discharged 4 times now, December 30th, December 31st, January 2nd, January 3rd. Each time processed completely, each time failing in different ways. That he wasn't sure anymore what discharge meant, whether it was a system status or a physical departure or a psychological state he couldn't quite reach. He said the hospital had become his location, that he existed here now, that leaving would require him to exist somewhere else, and he wasn't certain he could. I don't know what to do. The system shows him discharged, the bed shows occupied. His insurance stopped paying on January the 2nd. He's paying out of pocket for voluntary residence in a psychiatric hospital he's no longer officially admitted to. The administration hasn't intervened because he's not causing problems and the bed would otherwise be empty during the slow post-holiday period. But eventually someone will notice. Eventually the bed will be needed. Eventually William will have to leave. Or maybe he won't. Maybe he's discovered something the rest of us don't understand. That discharge isn't about system status or physical departure, but about psychological readiness to exist outside institutional structure. That some people can be discharged administratively but never successfully leave because the institution has become more real than the world outside it. That documentation of discharge doesn't create discharge. It only documents the failure to make departure equivalent to leaving. I submitted my resignation yesterday. I told my supervisor I was accepting a position elsewhere. She asked where. I said I wasn't certain yet. The truth is, I don't have another position. I just can't continue facilitating discharges when I've learned that discharge and departure are not the same thing. That you can process someone's exit completely while they remain present. That the system can release someone who continues to occupy the space they were supposed to have left. William is still there. In a room assigned to him under an admission that ended 6 days ago, eating meals delivered to a bed the census shows as vacant. Participating in treatment for a hospitalization the records show as concluded. Existing in a hospital he's been discharged from, waiting for a departure that may never align with his documented release. And I wonder how many other patients are like him. Discharged in the system but present on the units. Released on paper but remaining in rooms. Sent home in documentation while continuing to occupy beds. Because maybe discharge was never about leaving. Maybe it was always about learning to exist in the space between admitted and released, between patient and person, between documented departure and actual absence. Some people leave when they're discharged, others just become former patients who never left. And the system accommodates both because in the end, status is just data, and presence is just persistence, and sometimes the only difference between them is whether anyone notices the discrepancy. Story 7. Closing the ward file. The annual ward closure process was a final administrative ritual conducted every December 31st at Riverside Behavioral Health Center. As senior psychiatric administrator, I was responsible for reviewing the year's documentation, verifying that all admissions had corresponding discharges or active continuations, reconciling clinical records with billing data, and formally closing the annual file before the system reset for the new year. The process was tedious but essential, a comprehensive audit ensuring that no patient existed in administrative limbo, that no bed was simultaneously empty and occupied, that every person who had entered our care had an accurate, traceable path through our records. It typically took 4 hours to complete, required multiple levels of approval, and had to be finalized before midnight to prevent carryover errors into the new fiscal year. My name is Leonard Marsh, and I had worked in psychiatric administration for 26 years, the last 11 as senior administrator at Riverside. My role was primarily oversight and systems management, ensuring that clinical operations aligned with regulatory requirements, that documentation standards were maintained, that facilities operated within budget and capacity constraints. I had closed the annual ward file 10 consecutive times without significant discrepancy. The 2024 closure should have been routine. I began the process at 1800 hours on December 31st, alone in my office, working through the electronic checklist systematically. Total admissions for the calendar year, 847. Total discharges, 821. Current census, 26. The numbers balanced correctly. 847 admissions minus 821 discharges equals 26 patients currently in care. I proceeded to the next validation layer, cross-referencing individual admission records with discharge records to verify that every completed stay had proper documentation. This was where anomalies typically appeared. Duplicate entries, missing discharge summaries, timing discrepancies. The system generated the validation report, 820 matches confirmed, 0 discrepancies. I reviewed the current census list, 26 names, all with active bed assignments, all with recent clinical documentation, all with clear admission dates. Everything appeared correct. I moved to the financial reconciliation phase, comparing billed days to documented days. The totals matched. I reviewed staffing allocation against patient acuity metrics, within acceptable ranges. I checked for outstanding incident reports requiring year-end review. 3 minor incidents, all resolved. I verified that all controlled substance logs were current. They were. By 2000 hours, I had completed 90% of the closure checklist. Only the final step remained, executing the formal closure command, which would lock all 2024 data, archive the annual file, and prepare the system for 2025 operations. I entered my administrative credentials and initiated the closure process. A prompt appeared. Verify all active cases have continuation authorization for new fiscal year. I clicked yes. Another prompt. Confirm no open admissions without corresponding active status. I clicked yes. A third prompt. Review flag discrepancies before proceeding. I clicked view discrepancies. I expected the report to show 0 items. Instead, it showed 1 entry. Patient ID, LV2241232 pending. Name, Leon Voss. Admission date, December 32nd, 2024. Status, pending verification. Expected completion date, January 4th, 2025. Assigned clinician, C. Howell. Current location, unspecified. I stared at the screen, trying to process what I was seeing. December 32nd was not a valid date. Leon Voss was not a name I recognized. Pending verification was not a status designation that existed in our system architecture. C. Howell had been an intake clinician, but she'd resigned in early January. And expected completion date was not a field that appeared in admission records. I attempted to pull up the full patient file. The system denied access. Record locked pending administrative review. I checked my access permissions. I had top-level clearance to every file in the hospital. I tried again. Same error. I called IT support. The after-hours service answered. I explained the issue. The technician reviewed my account remotely. He said my permissions were configured correctly. That the record appeared to be isolated in a quarantine status that superseded normal access controls. He said he'd escalate it, but that senior engineers wouldn't be available until January 2nd. I told him the annual closure had to be completed tonight. He said he understood, but that accessing quarantined records required specialized database intervention he wasn't authorized to perform. He suggested I complete the closure and flag the discrepancy for follow-up in the new year. I asked if I could complete the closure with an unresolved discrepancy. He said technically yes if I documented the exception, but he noted that unresolved discrepancies would carry forward into the new fiscal year and would require reconciliation eventually. I thanked him and ended the call. I sat at my desk, looking at the single flagged entry. Every administrative instinct told me not to close the annual file with an unresolved discrepancy. Unresolved issues compound. They create cascading problems. They undermine the integrity of the entire record system. But I had no way to access the flagged record, no way to verify the information, no way to correct what appeared to be a data corruption error. And I had less than 4 hours to complete the closure before midnight. I made a decision. I would document the discrepancy formally, submit it as an exception, and proceed with the closure. I opened the exception log and began typing, Annual Closure 2024 executed with 1 unresolved discrepancy. Patient ID LV2124132 pending. Admission date listed as December 32nd, 2024. Invalid date. Likely system error. Status listed as pending verification. Non-standard designation. Record inaccessible due to quarantine status. Requires IT investigation and resolution. Recommended action. Database review and correction upon return of senior technical staff. I saved the exception log and attempted to proceed with the closure. The system prompted again. Unresolved discrepancy detected. Administrative acknowledgement required. A new form appeared. Something I'd never seen before in 10 years of annual closures. It was titled Acknowledgement of Ongoing Administrative Responsibility. The form read, By proceeding with annual closure while unresolved discrepancy exists, administrator acknowledges continued responsibility for flagged case until resolution. Administrator will receive periodic system notifications regarding case status and is required to respond to verification requests as issued. Do you accept ongoing responsibility for flagged case? The language was strange. I'd never heard of administrators maintaining responsibility for specific cases. My role was systems oversight, not clinical management, but the form required an answer to proceed. I clicked yes, assuming it was automated legal language with no practical implications. The system accepted my response. The closure process completed. The screen displayed, Annual Ward File 2024 archived successfully, all records locked. New fiscal year initiated. Administrator L. Marsh assigned case LV 2024-1232 pending resolution. I logged out of the system, documented the closure completion in my administrative log, and left the office at 2300 hours. I drove home, satisfied that I'd completed the closure despite the minor complication, confident that IT would resolve the corrupted record in the new year. On January the 2nd, I received an automated email from the medical record system. Subject: Verification request. Patient LV 2241232 pending. The email read, Expected completion date approaching for flagged case assigned to Administrator L. Marsh. Please verify current patient status and location to enable case resolution. Response required by January 4th, 2025 to maintain administrative record integrity. I logged into the system remotely and attempted to access the Leon Voss record again. Still denied. I called IT. The senior engineer I spoke with reviewed the situation. He said the record was in a legacy quarantine table that predated the current system architecture, that it appeared to have been migrated from an older database during a system update years ago but had never been properly integrated. That accessing it required running manual database queries that could take several days to properly execute. He said he'd add it to the queue, but that they were backlogged with higher priority issues from the year-end system reset. I asked how urgent it was. He said not very. It was a single orphaned record with invalid data, likely a migration artifact with no clinical significance. I asked why the system was sending me verification requests. He said that was odd, that automated notifications shouldn't be generating for quarantined records. He said he'd look into it. On January 4th, I received another email. Subject: Expected completion date reached. Patient LV 2024-1232 pending. The email read, Expected completion date has arrived for flagged case assigned to Administrator L. Marsh. Patient status verification is now required. Please confirm patient location and disposition. Failure to respond will result in case remaining in pending status indefinitely. I attempted to respond to the email explaining that I had no access to the record and that IT was investigating. The email address was automated and didn't accept replies. I called IT again. The engineer said he was still working on database access, that the record was more complex than anticipated, that it appeared to be linked to multiple system tables in ways that violated normal data relationships, that attempting to access or modify it without fully understanding the dependencies could corrupt other records. He said he'd continue investigating but couldn't give me a timeline for resolution. On January 6th, I began receiving daily verification requests. Same message, different timestamps. Each email more insistent. Verification overdue. Administrative response required. I documented each notification, submitted repeated requests to IT, and tried to ignore the growing anxiety that these automated messages created. On January 8th, I arrived at my office to find a new item in my system inbox. It was labeled Case Note, Patient LV 22-41232 pending. I opened it. The note was dated January 7th, written in professional clinical language. Patient continues to occupy transitional status. No physical location confirmed. Documentation remains incomplete. Administrator assigned to case has not completed verification responsibilities. Recommend escalation. The note had no author listed. I checked the metadata. Created by, system generated. But the content wasn't template language. It was specific, referring to me directly. Describing my failure to complete something I had no ability to complete. Over the following week, more case notes appeared. January 9th. Patient status verification still pending. Administrator L. Marsh has not responded to repeated system requests. Case remains in administrative limbo. January 11th. Extended delay in case resolution. Patient's pending status approaching 3 weeks. Administrative intervention required to enable closure. January 13th. Administrator L. Marsh continues to maintain responsibility for unresolved case per annual closure agreement. Patient awaiting verification. The notes were appearing daily, sometimes multiple times per day, all attributed to system generation, all describing my failure to verify the status of a patient I couldn't access and didn't believe existed. I contacted my supervisor, the hospital's chief operating officer, and explained the situation. He reviewed the records himself. He saw the flagged case, the verification requests, the accumulating case notes. He said it was clearly a technical error that had gotten out of control. He said he'd personally contact the software vendor and demand immediate resolution. 3 days later, he called me into his office. He said the vendor had reviewed our system logs, that they couldn't explain the flagged case, that the patient ID format didn't match any system they'd deployed, that the pending verification status didn't exist in their software, that the case notes appeared to be generating through a process external to their system architecture. They suggested our database had been compromised or corrupted by third-party software. They recommended a full system audit and potential database restoration from backup. I asked how long that would take. He said weeks, possibly months, and that it would require taking the medical record system offline during business hours, which would disrupt all clinical operations. He said we couldn't justify that level of intervention for a single anomalous record that wasn't affecting patient care. He told me to continue documenting the notifications and that we'd address it during the next scheduled system maintenance window in March. But the case notes continued, and they began to change in tone. January 18th. Patient Leon Voss remains under administrative oversight of L. Marsh. Current location unknown. Status unverified. Duration of administrative responsibility now exceeds standard parameters. January 21st. Administrator L. Marsh has maintained assigned responsibility for patient LV for 21 days without completing verification. Case file continues to accumulate unresolved documentation. Patient remains in transitional status awaiting administrator action. The notes were no longer just documenting my failure to respond. They were documenting the passage of time, as though someone or something were actively waiting. As though Leon Voss were a real patient in a real location, existing in administrative suspension, and my failure to verify his status was keeping him trapped there. On January 24th, I received a phone call at my office. The caller ID showed an internal extension. Room C, observation unit. I answered. There was silence, then a voice. Male, calm, measured. This is Leon Voss. I'm calling to verify my status. Can you confirm my location? I said nothing. The voice continued. I've been waiting for verification since December 32nd. You accepted administrative responsibility for my case. I need you to confirm where I am. I hung up. My hands were shaking. I called the observation unit. The unit clerk answered. I asked if anyone was in room C. She said no, that room had been empty for weeks. I asked if they'd received any calls from that extension. She checked the log. No outgoing calls from room C. I asked her to physically verify the room was empty. She said she would. She called back 5 minutes later. Empty. No phone off the hook. No equipment malfunction. No explanation for how a call could have originated from that extension. That night at home, I received an email on my personal account. Subject: patient location verification required. The email read, Administrator L. Marsh, you have not yet confirmed the location of patient Leon Voss. I am currently in pending status awaiting your verification. My expected completion date has passed. I remain in your administrative care until you confirm my disposition. Please verify my status so that case resolution can proceed. The email came from a hospital domain address, but from a user account that didn't exist in our directory. I blocked the address. The next morning I received the same message from a different address. I blocked that one. The messages continued from new addresses daily. On January 28th, I went to the hospital late at night after all administrative staff had left. I used my master access to enter the oldest section of the building, where the original medical records were stored before full digitization. I searched through archived admission logs from years past, looking for any reference to Leon Voss. I found nothing. No patient by that name had ever been admitted to Riverside Behavioral Health Center according to physical records. But when I returned to my office and logged into the computer, there was a new case note dated January 28, 2025. Administrator L. Marsh conducted physical record search for patient Leon Voss. No historical admission found. This confirms patient status as pending, existing in documentation without corresponding physical admission. Patient remains awaiting verification of non-admission, which would enable case closure. The note described what I had just done. It documented my action in real time, as though the system were observing me. And it suggested something I hadn't considered, that Leon Voss needed me to verify that he had never been admitted, that the verification required was confirmation of his non-existence, that the only way to close the case was to formally document that there was no case to close. I created a formal administrative memo dated January 29, 2025. I titled it Case Resolution, Patient LV 2024-1232 pending. I wrote, after comprehensive review, I verify that no patient named Leon Voss was admitted to Riverside Behavioral Health Center on December 32, 2024 or any other date. The flagged case represents a data artifact with no corresponding clinical reality. Patient status is confirmed as non-existent. Case is closed. I submitted the memo through the administrative filing system. I marked it as final. I logged out. The next morning, I received another case note. It read, Administrator L. Marsh has attempted to verify patient non-existence. However, verification of non-existence requires confirmation of current location, which has not been provided. Patient cannot be confirmed as non-existent without confirming where they are not located. Case remains open pending location verification. I understood then what was happening. The system required me to verify Leon Voss's location. But he had no location. He existed only as a pending case. The verification process itself was the trap. By accepting administrative responsibility for the case, I had become bound to something that could never be resolved. Because how do you verify the location of someone who exists only in documentation? How do you confirm the disposition of a patient who was never physically admitted? The case demanded verification of something that had no verifiable existence outside the request for verification itself. The case notes continue. Daily updates describing my ongoing administrative responsibility. Periodic calls from extensions that shouldn't be active. Emails from accounts that don't exist. all asking the same question. Can you confirm my location? Can you verify my status? Can you close my case? I haven't been able to close the annual ward file. It remains open, carrying forward into 2025, accumulating documentation about a patient who exists only as an unresolved discrepancy. And I am still assigned to the case, still responsible for verification. Still receiving requests to confirm the location of someone who occupies no physical space but who persists in every database, in every system notification, in every administrative log. I've learned that some cases can't be closed, that some admissions never end, not because the patient remains, but because the documentation of their presence continues indefinitely, generating its own reality, demanding verification that can never be provided. And that administrators who accept responsibility for impossible cases become permanent custodians of something that exists only in the space between filed and resolved, between admitted and discharged, between documented and real. The system still considers Leon Voss under my care. It sends me daily updates on his continued pending status. It expects me to maintain administrative oversight of someone who was admitted on a date that doesn't exist to a location that can't be confirmed. And perhaps that's what administration ultimately is, maintaining responsibility for the gaps in the system, for the patients who exist only as unresolved documentation, for the cases that can never be closed because closure requires verifying something that exists only in the request for verification. Some files stay open forever, not because the case is active, but because the system never stops asking for confirmation. And once you've accepted responsibility even for something impossible, the system expects you to fulfill it. Every day, every notification, every verification request, until you become less a person and more a persistent administrative obligation, existing primarily to acknowledge that something unresolvable remains under your care. I still receive the notifications. I'll receive them tomorrow, and the next day, and every day after, asking me to verify the location of a patient who exists nowhere except in the question itself. The annual closure has been completed, all cases resolved except one, and that one case continues to accumulate documentation, continues to generate notifications, continues to wait for verification that will never be provided. Because some patients don't discharge. They just become permanent administrative responsibilities assigned to people who made the mistake of accepting cases they couldn't resolve. And the system never forgets. It never stops requesting. It never closes the file. Some documentation doesn't end. It just waits, accumulating details about something that exists only in its own records, maintained by administrators who have become as trapped as the patients they're meant to process, suspended between verification and closure, between responsibility and resolution, between the system's expectations and the impossible reality of what we've been asked to confirm.